Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our latest edition of this podcast series on all things related to business immigration to the U.S. My name's Charles Raether. I'm the managing partner at Amlaw Group, and with me, as oftentimes we have as a guest, is our business development director, Alexander Verbitsky. Alex, how are you doing?
Very good, sir. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us once again, taking time out of your busy schedule. So today, we've talked about a number of business options in the past, the last couple months, business options for business owners in, overseas, Canada, Europe, wherever. And we've done a lot of discussions about E2s, but today I think you and I were going to talk about another business visa option that's very popular, very it's appropriate in certain circumstances. And I guess today we'll go through those details. And what we're talking about is the L-1 visa. And L-1 basically consists of two general categories, right? There's what's called L-1A and L-1B. And so today, Alex, maybe we can go through and maybe using some examples with particular client scenarios that you've had with, inquiries you've had or clients you've spoken with. And we can kind of talk about what's required, what are the, criteria, and maybe a little bit how it differs from an E2 or other business fees.
Yeah. Yeah, that'd be great. Definitely a lot of education we're gonna bestow on myself as well, right? Because I'm about the L1B, how the use cases can differ, right?
Right.
Because obviously, L1 is L1, but what's the A for and what's the B for? So maybe we could start with that, right?
Okay, okay,
Let's
yeah, because there's right, there's no E2A and
is
E2B or anything like that.
exactly. So let's do
Um,
that.
so yeah, L1A, so the L1A, which I think is probably the more common version, is where you have an executive or a manager coming over to either head up an existing business or help launch a new business in the US. So maybe let's take a step here back first to talk about what are the general requirements in an L1 scenario. So this applies to both the A and the B. So I'll just finish my explanation about the A and the
Yeah.
B. The A is for executives or managers. An executive for these purposes is somebody who kind of heads up the whole company. Manager is somebody who heads up a very important, distinct department or function in the company. So you could be the CFO or maybe the CMO or the director of production or something, depending on the company structure. So it's somebody who either heads up the whole company or a very large important function. So that's the L1A. L1B is an option for specialized knowledge workers. So it's kind of like an essential employee in an E2 scenario, very similar, but there can be differences. But with the L1B, we're showing that you're not necessarily, managing, 10, 20, 50, 100 people. You're not a manager or an executive. You have some specific experience, skills, very unique that are difficult to find in the US. And for that reason, they're bringing you over, from the foreign country to the US for you to apply your unique skills, knowledge, maybe train, et cetera. So let's talk about then, okay, that's what L1A and L1B are. Now, there's a whole lot of requirements that exist that don't exist, for example, with an E2. So what are we talking about? Unlike other business visas, so with the L1, we've got to show, first of all, you've been working overseas at a company that's affiliated with the company you're planning to work with or open up here in the US. So what does that mean? That means regardless of whether it's an L1A or an L1B, we have to show that in 1 year over the past previous 3 years, you've worked in a full-time position at this affiliated company overseas. Now, what do I mean by affiliated company? That means there's a company overseas outside the US that is either that has the same ownership, majority ownership at least, same ownership overseas as it will have in the US company. So a very typical scenario, John Smith owns a small plant in Canada, or maybe let's say he owns it with, two other partners. So there's three owners. And if those three owners also open or acquire a business in the US, roughly in the same proportionate shares. So, if they each have 33% in Canada, they have to have 33% each here in the US. So you have common ownership, then that qualifies those two businesses in the US and overseas as being affiliated, right? Or the other option is if you've got an overseas company and that overseas company is going to be the owner of the US company. So not the individuals are the owners, but the company itself, that also qualifies as a qualified relationship. So that's the first thing. We've got to show that the employee, whether it's an L1A or L1B, has worked at least 1 year in the previous 3 years for this company that's overseas. That's the first
Okay.
requirement.
Okay, so in short, no new hires, right? You can't just hire someone,
Yep.
let's say from Canada, and say, we want you to come and work for us at our US office, right? That's a no no. You have to work in that foreign company, and then you could be transferred over to the US company,
You got it.
correct?
Right, exactly. So
Okay,
so
okay,
unlike
right
other
on.
scenarios, you gotta have at least 1 year experience at that foreign company. Yep, absolutely.
Okay, got it. And then actually have one more question, and it has to do with, oh gosh, I had it. It has, oh, qualifications of the people. So the L1A, I understand. Executive is executive. I feel like it doesn't require any sort of background knowledge or resume, undergraduate, master's degree. Does the L1B have anything to do with that, right? Do the employees have to have like a certain degree or resume other than the 1 year worked for this company? Like, how do you prove this specialized knowledge, right?
Mhm.
Do you need an education? Or is it just because you were in that position? Can we prove that you have that specialized knowledge?
Yeah, the good question. So with the L1B, there's no minimum education like kind of like with an NIW. NIW, you have to have a master's degree, for example. So there's no minimum education. So I would say what makes that person unique for an L1B is their experience, right? That they've worked for this company long enough that, maybe this company has some proprietary software or proprietary production systems, and it doesn't exist anywhere out there. And now they want to replicate this in the US. Well, they need this person who knows how they do the production overseas. That person's got to come to the US, for example.
Okay.
So yeah, so that uniqueness of the L1B candidate is generally based on their experience working for the company because it's so unique that, it's theoretically difficult to find somebody who you can just plug and play in the US who could take that person's position,
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's so like you're mentioning plants and production, and I'm just wondering, would a simple, let's say, I'm not saying simple, say a CNC operator, would that qualify someone for an L1B, right? That
what's a CNC an operator? CNC op
oh, it's like this large machine, and you could cut out things in metal. I think it
Oh,
has to do
okay.
with AutoCAD. So essentially, you're either putting a big block of metal or a sheet of metal, and then a laser or a tool is coming and sort of cutting out whatever design you have, right? And so these operators, they sort of have to place the material on the machine correctly, and then they have to program the machine with the design, and then they just sort of watch the machine do its thing, because if something goes off, then obviously the production
Right,
goes
right,
down,
yeah.
right?
Well,
So yeah.
I'm not too familiar with what CNC operators do, how many they are, how widespread they are, how easily trained they are, but I would say based on kinda what you said, it potentially could be an L1B candidate. If this is something that requires, they can't learn how to do this in a matter of weeks or maybe a few months, it takes maybe 6 months, 12 months longer to learn how to do this properly. I would say that would probably be a good candidate for an
Okay,
L1.
perfect. I think that answers it. I think it's more of my question of, if they knew nothing about it going into this company, and then in 12 months they've learned and made themselves, let's say, valuable to this company, is that enough for them to be transferred over and sort of prove that they are that essential employee,
Right,
essentially?
right, right.
Okay, all right,
I mean,
cool.
the people get creative too sometimes. I've seen cases where an L1B employee was like, maybe a sushi chef or just some kind of chef from a particular country because they know how to make the dishes in this, like a Turkish,
Right.
cook or something. And they know how to make this. And, it's not common knowledge how you make these dishes in the US. I mean, I know the immigration service sometimes is kind of pushed back in cases like that, but you can get creative. So it just depends on the situation.
Okay. Okay, great.
Yep, that's that. With the L1A, I think the biggest we kind of discussed the criteria be, and I think we have a good handle on that. With the L1A, what we've got to show generally is that that person at the foreign company where they worked a year out of the previous 3 years, that person oversaw or managed, usually we like to say 10 people or more, it could be maybe 8. We tend to say for simplicity's sake, just to say 10 people or more. Because again, if you're a manager or you're an executive, they wanna see that you're managing roughly 10 people or more. If it's less than that, they kind of like, "Eh, you're not much of a manager here." Window washers or, stuff like that, or 10 I don't know what's another example, 10 programmers, computer programmers. They wanna see a hierarchy of the employees underneath the candidate. So let's say our candidates here at the CFO, they wanna see then at least 2 mid-level managers underneath that candidate, right? So 2 mid-level managers. Again, these to be a mid-level manager, you have to have a higher education, like a bachelor's degree or higher. And then under each of these 2 mid-level managers, you've got then, the remaining employees that we talked about. So they wanna see that hierarchy of at least 3 levels, both at the foreign company and then also at the US company after it's fully operating. So that's, I would say, what's the most critical thing for an L1, it's generally, at least if you're talking about an L1A, it's that hierarchy of personnel, ensuring that the mid-level managers have a higher degree, and then showing that our person, our client at the top here, is managing all the work that they don't want people that are doing the work itself, right? They don't want somebody who's out there, writing the code, stuff like that. They want you to be managing people who do that through another level of management. That is the most important factor, I would say, in an L1. And that's what makes it difficult maybe for small businesses, right? Because unlike, let's say, an E2, you might have a business with just 1 or 2 people. You're good, you're making money, you can renew it. It's not a big deal. But with an L1, it's not gonna work, right? Because we gotta create that level of employees or that structure of employees in the US as well. So let's
Hmm.
talk a little bit about what you gotta do on the US side and what makes this a little bit more challenging sometimes. Well,
So I got a quick question. So with regards to the L1A and the foreign business, so that means anyone that is interested in the L1A as an executive, they only qualify for this visa if their company has a minimum of 8 employees, right? You have to have a decent sized company in your country, in your foreign country.
right.
And okay, and then you also mentioned that you plan on doing the same in the US. What's the timeline look like, right? Because my understanding is that these L1A and L1B visas are only issued for a 1 year period and you could renew it for up to 2 year period, right? And so does that mean that the executive has 1 year to sort of replicate what they've been doing in their foreign country, whereas they hire 2 managers and subordinates under those managers?
So that's the case if you're doing a startup in the US. If you're creating a new company here in the US in conjunction with the L1A, you didn't have any operations here before. So that's a good question. Let's break out what happens on the US side of things. So if you look, there's probably 2 big categories of companies that we deal with for L1s. We call them the startups. So in any case, you've got to have an ongoing business overseas that's been operating more than a year. Doesn't matter what you're doing for an L1. You got to have that in any scenario. But then there's kind of 2 different possible divergences, once you come to the US. It might be a case where they've already had an operating business in the US for some time, right? It could be an established business and, maybe they didn't need any L1s for a while. They just had local hires Americans, but now they realize, hey, we got to bring these people over from Europe, from Canada, whatever. So they've got ongoing operations in the US. Or the other common scenario, and probably the more common scenario that we deal with, is what's with startup scenarios. So they're starting up the new branch or the new subsidiary here in the US. And in that case, when you're doing a startup, they will give you the L1 only for you just recently acquired an existing US business that has at least 8 employees or more and it's been operating business, or you're acquiring an existing business that's been operating for a while, then you're L1 right away for 3 years.
Got it. So the biggest difference is the startup versus the established,
Mhm.
right? So and I just want to clarify or just understand this. If I'm operating a business in Canada, I have my eight employees with hierarchy, and we are going to purchase a business in the United States, whether it's the my company making that purchase or me, the individual making that purchase. That existing company, let's say, has 8 or more employees. That qualifies me for the L1A visa, but it also qualifies any of my existing employees that I sort of want to do that transfer with the L1B to the, let's say, the newly purchased business, right?
Well, I wouldn't say it means any of your Canadian employees,
No, no, no.
any, but yeah, as long as they qualified as a specialized knowledge worker or as a manager. Yep, exactly.
Okay,
Now here's
very
the
good.
interesting, so people might be thinking in the back of their head, anybody who knows a little bit about immigration law, they're thinking, "Well, why would I even need to bother with an L1 if I could it sounds like I could do all these things with an E2," right? And so the one thing I wanna kind of flag to your attention is where these L1s are most advantageous, is where the company in question, let's say, is in a country that's not a treaty country for the E2. So we keep using this example of Canada. Canadians are eligible for an E2, but let's say you've got, let's say you're Indian or Chinese or Russian or Brazilian. None of these countries are eligible for an E2. So that's where this L1 becomes so critical. That if you've got a business and the owner or owners are not E2, treaty or citizens that could qualify for the E2, that's where this L1 comes in it comes into use. Or here's the other scenario. Or if you've got a business that's a really global multinational business, and you might have the company is in Canada, but most of your employees are not Canadian, right? They're Indian or Russian or Chinese or all these other ones. Maybe theoretically some of them might qualify for the E2 as an essential employee. But again, if they're not the same nationality as the owners, they're not going to qualify for the E2. Even if they're from a country that has an E2 treaty. So let's say the owners of the company are Canadian, but let's say you're Japanese, right? Okay, great. Japan, Canada, they all qualify for the E2. But if you're a Japanese employee working for a Canadian company, E2 is not going to help you, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then obviously the other big one, which I found out, was the immigrant intent, right? Under L1A, you can have immigrant intent because a direct path to getting a green card is eventually qualifying for the EB1C,
Right.
right?
Right, right, yeah. So that's a good thing too, right. That's a benefit I would say also of the L1. So as you can see, the L1's more complicated, and we haven't even gone through all the complications with it.
Right.
But one of the other benefits of the L1 is, yes, if they suspect you're going to the embassy interview, they suspect you of planning to immigrate to the US or something, or you have immigrant intents, hey, that's not a basis for denying you for an L1 because you're allowed to do that. And so that's why a lot of cases, we might have clients that they've tried unsuccessfully to get an E2 and they were denied at the embassy because they said, "Hey, we think you want to immigrate. Sorry, we're not going to give you the E2." You might, if we can reconfigure your company and if you meet all the requirements, we can, and we do this sometimes is we refile as an L1 because in that case, hey, you want to immigrate, that's fine. That's not a basis for a denial for our client. And so you can
Great.
get around it that way. So anyway, so we digressed a little bit. So getting back to, I guess we were talking about what the requirements are in the US. So
Mhm.
like I said, the requirements, you've got to create that hierarchy of employees within the first year if you're in a startup scenario. The investment level, see here where it's a little bit more flexible than the E2s. With the investment level, there's no minimum investment amount with an L1, how much you put into the US company. So there's a lot more flexibility. Especially if it's in the scenario of a startup, all we have to do is we provide a business plan for this startup US entity, and we can play with the numbers a little bit to make it look like, you need more or less money before the company becomes self-sufficient. You just have to put enough money into the US company to make it self-sufficient based on your business plan estimates. So if you in your business plan, you're saying, "Hey, we're gonna reach profitability starting, end of second quarter," then you just look at the business plan. What are the expenditures until end of second quarter? That's what they wanna see you investing into the US company. So as you can imagine, you can have very, very, overly optimistic, prognoses or estimates or forecasts, and therefore you might not have to put as much money in. And so there's a lot of flexibility there as well.
So you could sort of play with it where in your business account, let's say to start up the business and let's say to sustain the business and its expenses, 40 grand for the next 6 months of expenses. And then the plan is to reinvest the capital of the earnings, hire one or two individuals, and then keep on growing and growing and reinvesting the capital, right? So would that be a good example of how much money you have to invest into the company or the business account? Because you have to sort of
No, well,
uh
how much you have to invest, you have to put that all up front, right, before you file, right? So if the company is earning, unless the company starts operations before you file for the L1, is that what you mean? That it's making some money before you file for the L1 and then you use that money?
I maybe I misunderstood, but what you said or may have said was that you sort of have to show projections of how the company will grow and be profitable over
Correct.
time. So when it comes to investment amount, it doesn't have to be like the E2 is, which is 100,000,
Yeah.
right? Scenario, we could say, the initial startup cost is, let's say, 20,000. I'm profitable by month 3 and start hiring, et cetera, and building this
Mhm.
company, right?
Right, right.
So it sounds like it's a good scenario for even like let's say IT companies, right? Because, in the world of IT or consulting, there's not much investment needed. That's where we find the most difficulty in E2 scenarios when someone calls us and says, we run a consulting firm or an IT firm, is that initial investment amount. So in this scenario, if you're a little bit larger in the foreign company, let's say Canada or the UK, and you have that hierarchy and you want to start that new business in the US, this is a little bit more favorable when it comes to the initial investment.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. I never thought of that. Yeah,
Okay.
we're actually like an IT company, a services company where you don't need to spend 100,000 to get things started, like in an E2 scenario. So in that regard, yeah, the L1 is a lot more flexible. I would say I don't think we've ever done it where the L1 only had, the applicant had to invest only 20,000. I suspect the government might say that's a little bit too small, but I would say something between, 40, 50, 60,000. That's very common, which is again quite a bit less than 100K for an E2, and it gives you some breathing room, like, you only need to invest 40K, and if you think after 3, 4 quarters, your business is already gonna be, generated some good income, that could be, yeah, a better option than an E2.
Great.
I would say just yeah, so that's a very good observation that if you don't need to invest that much upfront, the L1 might be better for you than the E2. I would say the only challenge not the only, but one of the bigger challenges for the L1, again, is creating that structure of employees here in the US. That's what sometimes trips up people because you've got to get things up and running fast enough within that first year if it's a startup scenario in order to get your renewal at the end of that first year.
Right, right. So just because you got the L1 visa doesn't mean you could sort of sit back and say, I'm here. There's really, I don't even know what the example is, but something chasing behind you saying, ramp up operations as soon as possible. Because if you don't, you're not going to have a
Yeah,
visa
that's
in
good.
12.
This is for the who was the founder of Intel? He said, "You always gotta be paranoid, right?" And so it's kinda maybe the L1. You can choose an L1 if you're kinda like that paranoid type, like, you're always you're pushing yourself, you're pushing the team, you're gonna grow. Because, yeah, with the E2, I don't wanna say you can slack off, but there's not that close of verifications, for the renewals, it's easier. I would say, yes, with the L1, the renewal, at least that first renewal, is could be difficult because they're gonna look at how many employees you got, what are your operations like, stuff like that. So you gotta be
Gotcha.
confident there with that. What else should we discuss about the L1? Again, similarities and differences with the E2. With the L1, here's a big difference maybe with the E2. L1, you always need an office. They're sticklers about that. Even if you could make the argument you don't really need an office, yeah, that's just you're opening yourself for big problems if you really insist on not getting an office. They're sticklers. You have to show photographs of the desks in place or the equipment there already, stuff like that. So they want to be convinced that, everything you're ready to get started, immediately once you get the approval.
What about co-working space? Does that work?
Yeah, a co-working space. No, I think that's very risky. I'd say that's risky.
Well, they offer private offices as well, right? So you
Yeah,
can
they do.
rent
So at
like
office, and you could
rooms.
show that this is for your exclusive use. Other people can't use it. Then that's okay. Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. Okay.
But yeah, with E2s, there's more flexibility with that. So yeah, with the L1s, you've got to, they're sticklers with the office space. Here's an advantage of the L1 though, compared to maybe E2 or other visas, is you really don't have to show source of funds. So as you know, in the E2, we've got to do an analysis of where the money came from. Did they pay all their taxes, stuff like that. With the L1, it's easy. I mean, it's literally if you put 60K into your US company, all you need is a bank statement that just shows, "Hey, I wired it to my, US company," or a confirmation from the US company that they got the money from your account overseas, and that's it. You don't have to show anything where that money came from.
Wow. Okay. Great.
Well, I'm not trying to promote money laundering here or anything, but
Yeah.
it's a lot easier.
Okay.
What else? I mean, maybe we should talk about kinda like, ideal case uses or case studies like with the L1.
Well, we've been talking about startups this whole time, right? Company is established in the foreign and that they're starting up. What are the use cases for an established company, right? So, likely, the way that I see it is that if you have, let's say, a Canadian headquarters and you already have a US headquarters and both of these companies are operating, typically the most common use cases would be the L1B, where you're transferring employees from, let's say, Canada to the US, right? So for the larger corporations that, want to transfer employees, this is an option for them.
Right. I think for established companies, and so when we say established, we're referring to the US side because in any scenario, you've got to have an established company on the foreign side. So if we're talking about established companies where they've already have a US operation ongoing here, I think you're right, Alex. In some cases, L1B would be a very typical use case, but also L1A too. I mean, you could have managers, maybe the executive, the head honcho, he got his her L1A years ago or something, but they want to bring over, the head of finance or the head of production or some other major managerial position, person that's had a, maybe not the CEO level, but slightly lower vice president level or something. So I can see even with an established company in the US, a common use case is also L1As bringing over
Okay.
managers.
Got it. And for both use cases, both L1A and L1B, the green card path is EB1C, correct?
Correct. Right.
Okay.
But I would more so with the L1A. With the L1B, depends on their job status or their job duties. L1B is more difficult to do a green card through an EB1C because the EB1C again is for executives or managers, right? So there's a clear connection between L1A and EB1C, right? They're all managers or executives. With L1B, going to be more difficult. I think if you're in an L1B and you want to get to a green card, as a general rule, it depends on the specifics, but as a general rule, if you wanna do that, you'd probably have to go the route of an EB2 or an EB3, right? So
Okay.
the US company would need to get a labor cert, petition you. I mean, it's all doable, it just takes a lot more time than the EB1C route.
Yeah, yeah, that's I think that's the biggest issue with the EB2, EB3. Not that it's an issue, it's just the time, right? So my question is, and I know I'm sort of veering off a little bit, but just for the people that are L1B interested people, the EB2 takes what, 2 to 3, 3 to 4 years to get approved
Yep,
once submitted,
right.
right? And if the L1B only lasts, let's say initially 1 year and then could be renewed for an additional 2 years, let's call it 3 years total, it doesn't really give them much time to even submit an EB2, EB3.
Well, you're right. So first of all, you can extend the L1B twice, so you could get a total of 5 years. But I think generally in
Okay.
that 5-year period, you could probably get the EB2, EB3 approved. But let's say they didn't start the process right away. The employer resisted for a couple of years, and then they finally said, "Okay, sure, you're a good guy. Here, we'll do your EB2, EB3." But yeah, you're right. There is a risk that you might not get the approval for the EB2 or the EB3 prior to the L1B extensions ending. So you might have to go back to your home country. You might have to get some other visa here, maybe an H-1B to keep you here until the EB2, EB3 gets approved. But that's why I think that is one big advantage with the L1s as well. Why people are interested in the L1s is because of that relatively straightforward transition from an L1 to a green card through the EB1C. And sometimes people get this confused. The EB1C is not the same thing as the L1 because sometimes people say, "Oh, I bought a company in the US or I opened a company, I'm going to get a green card." Well, no, just because you're gonna have to start with the L1 because if it's a new company, startup in the US, and then after that, you file with the EB1C. So just because you got approved for the L1, there's no guarantee you're gonna get the green card through the EB1C. But the chances are relatively high because the criteria overlap so much. So the requirements for the L1 about having 8 to 10 employees, having that experience of 1 year in the past 3 years, those are the same requirements for the EB1C. So you do get the L1, you're a good way along the path to getting the green card.
That's another good point with regards to the timeline of everything, right? Like
Uh,
you can't do those two extensions and work in the US company for 5 years and expect that you can apply for the EB1C because you need to have had worked 1 year
Ooh.
in the foreign company, right?
Good question. Here, this is what you earn your brownie points for today. I didn't bring this up before because I didn't want to confuse things. But if you're coming to the US in an L1 status, the clock freezes. So, meaning if you're coming on the L1, it doesn't mean you've got to get the EB1C within, 2 years after that so that you got that 1 year look back. The clock freezes. So that's an exception. When you enter on an L1, you could stay here 6 years, let's say, something like that, 5 years, right? And then you could still do the look back. Did I work for the foreign company in one of the previous 3 years? They'll look back to the date just before you entered on the L1. So you see what
Oh, okay. But
they're okay if you leave for short periods of time, right? So
okay.
so if you've got the L1, let's say, and you've renewed it once or twice, and let's say this is your 5th year of having the L1, and sure, let's say you leave the US business trips periodically, stuff like that. They're not going to count short trips, under 30 days when you're outside the US. That doesn't break.
Okay.
Very good point. I didn't bring it up earlier, but yes, if you enter on an L1 and then later want to convert to the EB1C, then, you can do that after 3 years. You could wait longer, 4 years, 5 years. So that way, it's something to keep in mind. And we sometimes with our E2 clients, we might say, sure, if you want to do an E2, you could convert to a green card theoretically through an EB1C if you had the foreign company, all that other stuff. But yeah, there you're limited. And you might remember we had a client, I think last year, Alex, who from Germany was very insistent. They wanted to try to get that EB1C, but because they had been here so many years in that E2, we just couldn't look back and show that he had worked overseas in 1 year of the previous 3 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, so that's that.
Wow. Lot of information.
Lot of
I'm
information. Yeah.
Woo.
So hopefully, hey, by the time, maybe when this podcast goes live, we might not have all those materials, but we can later post in the description below a nice overview or presentation or an ebook that we can let
Right.
people with all these, because there's a lot of moving parts. It gets confusing, but I guess that's why people come to us to help them organize these things, grab them, take them by the hand and say, here, this is what we got to do. Don't worry, we'll get it handled.
Yeah, for sure. So we constantly update the website. So materials are always going to be there with regards to the respective visa that you're interested in. And if you don't know what you qualify for or want to get, and you are, let's say, running a company or working for a company, and this podcast sort of resonates with you and your situation, there's going to be links in the description below where you can book a consultation with Charles one-on-one, or you could book a preliminary call with myself just to sort of figure out your situation prior to any sort of paid consultation.
Absolutely. And here's no, we haven't brought this up, but I'm sure clients are interested. What are my chances of getting an L1 or an EB1C, right? Like, what are the stats better for L1s than, say, E2s or other visas? It's difficult to say. I would say, right, like a typical lawyer, it depends, right? It depends on so many, your individual factors, your history, the company's history, what your role has been at the company, what your position has been, your job duties. It all depends on that. But I would say, put it like this, if we can get you to the point of getting the L1 approval and then later you want to do the EB1C, in all honesty, I can't remember the last time we've had a denial for an EB1C. I think it's probably been about like 8 years or so. So, the biggest challenge is maybe getting that first L1. That's the biggest challenge, and maybe the renewal. Because like we said, if it's in a startup scenario, you've got to show that you've hired those 8 to 10 people, you got the business up and running. That's where that biggest hurdle is. But if we can get past that hurdle successfully, generally it's pretty smooth sailing after that, whether it's renewing the L1 or if it's, converting it to a green card through an EB1.
Great.
So I can't remember last time we've had an L1 denial as well. Maybe it's just old age and I'm just forgetting all this stuff. But no, in reality, I think the numbers are very good. And I don't think the approvals are not as good. I wouldn't say that the approvals are less than with an E2. It's just the requirements are a little bit higher. And so sometimes we might just say, clients, look, we'd love to work with you, but we can't because you're just not meeting the minimum criteria for the L1. So we want to make sure you meet the minimum requirements, that you have a realistically good chance at getting the L1. And, that way everybody's just happy. We don't want to mislead people or give them false expectations. So
Right. And I think, listen, I think one last question that I have is the golden question, right? Because this visa has immigrant intent, or you are allowed to have immigrant intent, the current administration affect your chances of getting this visa, right? Because I know that with non-immigrant based visas, the current administration, it doesn't really affect the non-immigrant intent visas. But with regards to immigrant intent, that's where it gets a little bit troublesome. So with the
well,
L1A, what do you think?
yeah, that's a good point. And actually, under this current administration with Trump, actually, the L1 is kind of being protected. And so, what am I talking about? If you guys remember, when was that? In May of this year, right? May of 2026, the administration came out with their new policy saying, we're not going to let people adjust status so easily in the US, right? If you're here on a non immigrant visa, and then you want to say, hey, I want to get an EB1, and you came as a tourist, the government's now saying, hey, you got to give us a good reason why we should let you adjust here and not go back to the embassy in your home country. But in that memo where they came out with this policy, they specifically indicated, but hey, don't worry. If you're an H-1B holder or an L-1 holder, We understand these are dual intent visas. We understand you can have the intent to immigrate even though it's a non-immigrant visa. So the Trump administration, as harsh as it can be with immigration policy, they're recognizing this special status for L1s, and so they
Great.
acknowledged it. So yeah, with these tightened policies, especially with adjustment of status, you're actually protected
Great.
with an L1. So that's another
Yeah.
big advantage.
Great news.
Yeah, yeah. So hopefully, yeah, this was helpful for our viewers. And as always, it's like Alex said, if you want to reach out for an initial conversation with him or set up a conversation with myself or somebody from the legal staff, we're happy to do that and then walk you through the L1 or what other, options might be, worth considering for you and your family. Thanks,
Perfect.
Alex, for your time.
Thank you for having me, Charles.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Till next time, we'll see you.
See ya.
Thanks. Bye.